November 17, 1965. The Ia Drang Valley, in the central highlands of South Vietnam, about 35 miles southwest of Pleiku. The 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, had marched out of LZ X-ray at 0910 that morning. Most of the men had not slept in 2 days. The column was strung out across 500 meters of elephant grass under a triple jungle canopy. At 13:15, the lead element was 150 meters from a clearing on the map called Landing Zone Albany. 155 Americans would be dead before the next sunrise. 124 more would be wounded. It would be the deadliest single day of the entire Vietnam War. The man on the other side, Lieutenant Colonel Nguyen Huu An, the commander of the People's Army of Vietnam's 66th Regiment, had given his subordinates one instruction: move inside the column, grab them by the belt, stay so close that the artillery and the aircraft cannot fire without killing their own. Ia Drang was not one battle, it was two. The first ran from the 14th to the 16th of November at a clearing called LZ X-ray. Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore had landed the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry inside the base camps of 3 regiments of the People's Army of Vietnam. He had fewer than 500 men. They had walked into the bivouac of more than 2,000. Moore held the perimeter for 2 days against repeated assaults. Helicopter-mounted reinforcements came in. Artillery fired from a battery at LZ Falcon. Sky Raiders worked the tree lines. A B-52 strike came down on the Chu Pong Massif. By the morning of the 17th, Colonel Tim Brown, commanding the 3rd Brigade, had ordered Moore's battalion lifted out. 2 fresh battalions held X-ray overnight. The 2nd of the 5th Cavalry, under Lieutenant Colonel Bob Tully, and the 2nd of the 7th Cavalry, under Lieutenant Colonel Robert McDade. The 2nd of the 7th had inherited Moore's regimental designator and Custer's old guidon. It was not Moore's battalion. 3 weeks before the operation, McDade had been the 1st Cavalry Division's personnel officer. He had not commanded troops in 10 years. On the morning of the 17th, McDade was told to move his battalion out before another B-52 strike came down on the surrounding ridgelines. The 2nd of the 5th would walk southeast to LZ Columbus and stay there. The 2nd of the 7th would walk northeast, branch north, and set up at a clearing called Albany for helicopter extraction. The operation order took less than 2 hours to issue and prepare. Captain Joel Sugdinis, commanding Alpha Company, told his men afterward that the situation was, in his own word, unclear. There was no contingency plan for contact. McDade had been offered preparatory artillery support from Tully's battalion. He had declined it. The march began at 0910. Men carried packs that weighed 80 to 110 pounds. The grass came up to their knees and then to their chests. The single canopy thickened to triple. The heat rose. The visibility dropped. The order of march was reconnaissance platoon, then Alpha, Delta, Charlie, Headquarters, and Captain George Forrest's Alpha Company of the 1st of the 5th Cavalry attached at the rear. Soldiers who had not slept in 2 days began discarding equipment to lighten their loads. Along the route, the column was ordered to burn a cluster of empty grass huts. The smoke went up. It was visible for miles. A few hours earlier, a Huey pilot named Hank Ainsworth had overflown LZ Albany and reported negative enemy contact. Colonel Brown, given that report, had decided to withhold preparatory artillery fires on the LZ so as not to telegraph the battalion's arrival. The smoke from the huts had already telegraphed it. About 150 meters short of the LZ, First Lieutenant Pat Payne, the reconnaissance platoon leader, saw a PAVN soldier asleep behind a 6-foot termite mound. He jumped him and took him alive. His platoon sergeant captured a second man 10 yards away. A third one ran. No report of the runner was passed up the chain of command. The 2 prisoners said they were deserters. They were not. McDade called his company commanders forward to plan the LZ occupation. Captain Forrest, at the back of the column, had to cover 500 meters on foot to reach the meeting. Captain Sugdinis brought his radio operator. So did the others. Their companies remained where they were, scattered along the column, without contact to artillery or air support. Battalion Sergeant Major James Scott and Sergeant Charles Bass, who spoke Vietnamese, tried again to question the prisoners. Bass listened to the trees. The voices were Vietnamese. They were not from the prisoners. By that point, McDade and his command group were already moving across the LZ towards a stand of trees in the middle of it. The rest of the battalion was strung out behind them through 500 meters of grass. Many, ordered to halt, had sat down where they were. Some closed their eyes. No one was on perimeter security. It was 13:15. The first burst came from the front of the column. Within minutes, it had run down the right flank along the full length of the formation. The 8th Battalion of the 66th Regiment, 550 men under Senior Lieutenant Lê Xuân Phuoc, had camped to the northeast. The 1st of the 33rd Regiment was alongside them. 3 companies of the 8th Battalion struck the head of the column. 2 companies of the 1st of the 33rd peeled south to attack the flanks. An L-shaped ambush, executed by infantry that had walked into position while the 2nd of the 7th was eating sea rations. Charlie and Alpha companies lost 70 men in the first few minutes. The PAVN closed inside 10 and 20 meters of the cavalry troopers in the opening exchanges. The doctrine had been refined the week before by Lieutenant Colonel Nguyen Huu An, the 66th Regiment's commander, and given to his battalion commanders before the operation. Move inside the column, grab them by the belt, stay so close that the artillery and the aircraft cannot fire without killing their own. It worked the way he'd described it. Airstrikes could not be brought in safely. Artillery could not be brought in safely. First Lieutenant Larry Gwynn, the Alpha Company executive officer, would later write that most of his company's casualties came in the first 30 minutes. In the middle of Charlie Company, a private first class named Jack Smith found his executive officer, First Lieutenant Don Cornett, shot in the back to the right of the spine. The bullet was still in him. Smith ripped off Cornett's shirt, removed his gear with a rifleman named Wilson, and bandaged the wound. Cornett gave Smith his wife's name and asked Smith to tell her, if he didn't make it, that he loved her. Charlie Company found and destroyed the PAVN mortar position that was firing into the column. That gave the rest of the battalion enough freedom of maneuver to begin firing back as more than disorganized squads. Gwynn would later describe the next phase of the fight in a single image: PAVN soldiers walking through the elephant grass looking for surviving Americans sniping back at them one by one. By 1426, the battalion command element had been pinned inside the stand of trees with Alpha Company. The rest of the battalion was fighting as squad and platoon-sized clusters in the grass. Major Frank Henry, the battalion executive officer, and Captain Joe Price, the fire support officer, began calling in fires onto positions where they could be reasonably sure no Americans remained. A-1E Sky Raiders dropped napalm. Some of the napalm fell on Americans. Some of the artillery did too. Lê Xuân Phoi, leading from the front, was mortally wounded about an hour into the fight. He died after dark. He was the only senior officer on either side killed at Albany. At 16:30, Captain Bus Tully's Bravo Company of the 1st of the 5th Cavalry, marching from LZ Columbus, made contact with the rear of the column and began pushing forward. At 18:45, Captain Myron Diderick's Bravo Company of the 2nd of the 7th, still raw from X-ray, landed by helicopter on the LZ to reinforce the perimeter. At 21:46, helicopters from the 229th Aviation Battalion came in to take the wounded out after other crews had refused the LZ as too hot. The fighting died down across the early morning. At first light, McDade ordered every weapon in the perimeter to fire into every suspected enemy position around it. No one fired back. The battle was over. The numbers came in over the next 24 hours. 155 Americans dead, 124 wounded, 403 PAVN dead, 450 wounded. Charlie Company of the 2nd of the 7th had started the morning with around 110 men. By the next morning, 8 were still on their feet. A battalion that had marched into the LZ with around 400 men walked out aboard 4 2.5-ton trucks. It was the deadliest single day of the Vietnam War. It remains so. The Defense POW MIA accounting agency still carries 2 men from the Ia Drang campaign as unaccounted for. The 1st Cavalry Division Forward Command did not call it an ambush. Brigadier General Richard Knowles, the Forward Command Post Commander, called it a meeting engagement and held a press conference to that effect. When General Harry Kennard, the division commander, later read the casualty count, he said he had not been told the fight at Albany was that bad. "We had ample resources to reinforce," he told an interviewer years later. How Moore's men would have gone in a minute, no one asked. On the PAVN side, the lesson became doctrine. The Central Highlands Front under Brigadier General Chu Hui Man had wanted to learn how the Americans would use their helicopters, their artillery, their close air support, and their B-52s. They had learned at X-ray, and they had learned again at Albany. The answer was to close inside the column tight enough that the American advantages neutralized themselves. Get inside, grab the belt. Nguyen Huu An would write later that the order had been given before X-ray, refined at X-ray, and proven at Albany. It would shape the way the People's Army fought the United States Army for the next 8 years. Decades later, the analysis written for the Maneuver Captain's Career Course at Fort Benning would conclude that McDade's battalion had violated 3 of the 5 principles of patrolling on the way into the LZ: reconnaissance, control, and common sense. The author was Captain J. Dallas Henry, 3rd-generation combat arms officer and grandson of Major Frank Henry, the 2nd of the 7th's executive officer who had called the napalm down on the trees that afternoon. LZ X-Ray became a book in 1992 by Hal Moore and Joseph Galloway, and a film in 2002 that ends before the column ever steps off for Albany. Albany has its own books: Larry Gwynn's, James Lawrence's, Bud Alley's, Jack Smith's article. It has no film. It has a memorial at Fort Moore in Georgia. It does not have one in the Ia Drang Valley, where the clearing is back under elephant grass and triple canopy, and the termite mound where Pat Payne caught the sleeping scout is unmarked. James Lawrence, who came back from being paralyzed to finish his tour, has spent the last 60 years telling the story. He says that when most people look at the wall in Washington, they see 58,000 names. When he looks at it, he sees Don Cornett's name, 58,000 times.